Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Reassessing Gender Inequalities in the Labor Market Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Dennis van der Veer. I am working for the European Institute for Gender Equality based here in Vilnius, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. This is a webinar co-organized by the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, in short, Eurofound, and EIGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, the EU Knowledge Center on Gender Equality. I'm very happy you join us. We will have an interesting hour. You can join live with comments in the chat function. We are live on all the social media channels, YouTube, Facebook, so you can watch us also there. And I will take you now a little bit through the program. So we'll be talking today about gender equalities, or rather inequalities, in the labor market, impact of the pandemic. And I'm joined by three speakers who will guide us through the program and share with us their wisdom and insights. First of all, I'm happy to welcome John Hurley, Acting Head of Unit of the Employment Unit of Eurofound. John, welcome to this webinar. Then the second speaker of today will be Lina Salanauskaite, my colleague at EIGE. Lina, very welcome also to you.
Good afternoon.
Hello. And finally, Sanna Nivakoski from Eurofound at the Social Policies Unit Research Officer in Dublin. Welcome also very much to this webinar.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to take part.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's today, the 8th of March, the International Women's Day. And on that occasion, the cooperation between EIGE and Eurofound is taking place in this webinar. So today we'll be looking at labor market issue and gender equality. Now, without doubt, the labor market is generating greater possibilities for women now than half a century ago. But the pandemic obviously has brought gender differences into sharper focus. And that's what we'll be discussing today with our three experts. And we take that from a couple of different angles. We'll be looking and starting with John, looking a bit more generally into labor market and developments when it comes to participation of women and men. Then we move to Lina, who will reflect with us a little bit on the pandemic and what we have observed on so-called unpaid work. And finally, we go even deeper into the substance with Sanna focusing on teleworking and also childcare and what the pandemic has brought in terms of the work-life balance, an issue much debated, obviously, very much in the last couple of years. So that will be our program for the hour, and we will be taking questions later on. But first and foremost, I have the pleasure then to introduce John. John, Eurofound, acting head of unit in the employment unit at Eurofound, responsible for quite a number of areas, including the European Restructuring Monitor events database. You've been leading research projects. You will be guiding us a little bit into the topic of labor market, gender segregation, and developments over the last decades, I would say. Your floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. It's a great pleasure to be here with the EIGE colleagues, and thanks to all of them for organising this webinar. I'd like to start by introducing some broader labour market perspectives, if I may, just as a kind of introduction to our discussions today. A striking development in our labour markets over the last 2 decades has been, well, indeed even longer, has been the huge rise in female labour market participation. We estimate that more than 2 out of 3 net new jobs in the EU over the last 2 decades has been taken up by women. And this has led to a narrowing of the gender employment gap. Women now account for around 46% of employment headcount in the EU 27. This figure was less than 40% over 2 decades ago. So this is an indication that there are growing opportunities for women in the labour market. It's also part of course, of the consolidation of a long-term trend towards dual earner households, where both men and women in households are active in the labour market. Is this likely to continue? Well, yes, we think that based on EU policy targets, amongst other indicators, we foresee further progress in this area. One of the subsidiary targets of the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan is a halving of the gender employment gap over this decade. And for that to happen, by our estimates, this is going to require a further 3 new female jobs for every 1 new male jobs in the EU up to 2030. So one structural reason for this effectively, relatively high female employment growth is that women are more likely to be employed in the services sectors. These sectors are the growing part of our labour market in terms of headcount. They account for about 7 out of 10 jobs, and men are overrepresented, on the other hand, in sectors which are structurally declining. We're talking about manufacturing and agriculture. So you do have that kind of structural background explaining why male and female employment shares are tending to converge. So, I think one preliminary kind of conclusion is we can say with some confidence that the labour market is likely to continue generating greater possibilities for female participation. Now, what's interesting is that this narrowing of the gender employment gap has occurred, but it hasn't been accompanied by an increase or by a decrease rather in gender occupational segregation. Men and women have traditionally sorted into jobs in specific sectors and occupations, and there are very stereotypically male jobs such as construction labourers, and very stereotypically female jobs, female nurses, just to give an example. We might have expected, with the increase of female employment, that this segregation, occupational segregation, might have diminished. It actually hasn't at all. It's gone in the opposite direction. We estimate that less than 1/5 of employment in 2019, while less than 1/5 of total employment was in gender mixed jobs. So jobs where at least 40% of employment was female and male. So the reason for this, well, the big increase in female employment has tended to occur in jobs which were already dominated by females, or where females represented a majority. This was particularly the case in caring jobs, what we would call the caring economy. So jobs in the mainly state-paid sectors of health, education, and social care. These were the big sources of female employment growth over the last 2 decades. So the result is that the gender employment gap may be narrowing, but gender occupational segregation actually has been increasing. So, and other points of interest, well, one positive point of note is that much of the expansion of female employment has occurred in well-paid jobs, so jobs in the top 2 quintiles by pay. Female employment growth has consistently exceeded that of male employment over the last decade and a half in jobs in the top 40% of the job wage distribution. Again, with gains in particular in jobs such as those of teaching and health professionals, to give an example. But these changes have to be seen framed in the bigger picture. Women are still substantially overrepresented in low-wage jobs and substantially underrepresented, even if the gap is narrowing, in high-paid jobs. And importantly, the gender pay gap is very persistent. It's reducing only slowly. And it is highest in these well-paid jobs where employment growth has been most robust. The pandemic has brought some of these gender differences into sharper focus. There was some talk of the pandemic being what we call, or what American commentators call, the she session during the early stages of the pandemic in 2020. But in fact, job losses were somewhat heavier for men than women over the last 2 years. But if we look at how these job losses were distributed, we do see an important gender differentiation. During the most severe phase of the crisis, it was low-paid female employment that was most likely to be lost. This was the group most affected by lockdowns and by social distancing measures. The pandemic was also, of course, a time of increased remote working. And here too, there were very strong gender dimensions. Women were more likely to be working from home during the crisis than men. We think that this will continue, in all likelihood, will continue to be the case. We've done some research looking at the teleworkability of a specific occupation, so the extent to which different occupations, based on their task content, can be remotely worked. And we estimate that around 1/3, just over 1/3 of employment can be remotely worked in practice. This is about twice the level we observe from the Labour Force Survey data in 2020. But what's really interesting is that a much higher proportion of female employment is potentially teleworkable, about 45%, compared to only 30% of male employment. These, in general, the skews in teleworkable employment aren't just gendered, they're also in terms of wages and in terms of educational qualifications. It's a very, very specific population that can remotely work. It tends to be higher paid rather than lower paid, higher qualified than lower qualified. But again, one of the less remarked things that's been pointed out in a lot of commentary, but one of the things less pointed out has been the strong gender skew, and the fact that this may continue to be the case. So I think I'll leave it there, because I think Sana and Lena will probably draw on some of these potential implications, both of the increased remote working, but also of some of the other things that I've mentioned. The actual structural shifts which aren't leading, as we might have expected, to a diminution of the gender occupational segregation. So I'll pass over to Sana and Lena at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for this sort of good overview and starting point for the discussion, and also for introducing at least two concepts that I had never heard about: teleworkability and the she session concepts that perhaps also because of the pandemic have found its way into the discourse. Indeed, we're going to Lena. Indeed, we're moving a little bit to the COVID-19 pandemic implications for unpaid work, so-called unpaid work, long-term care and childcare issues, very heavily debated at the moment, also on the EU policy level. So the floor is yours. What can you share with us on these issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. It's really a pleasure to talk on these topics today on the 8th of March. So I'm happy to actually provide more details, also based on our most recent research that we are collecting at EIGE. So, of course, these are broad topics, and I would like to start my contribution today from what John has already highlighted, so that despite women's participation in the labor market increasing in the last decades, so was also occupational segregation. So as we show in various EIGE's research, gender segregation in the labor market narrows not only employment and education choices, it also narrows life choices. It's responsible for unequal pay. It reinforces gender stereotypes and also leads to increasingly uneven gender power relations. So it's not good news, of course, for the EU economy, and we know that. It leads to also labor market being less competitive and harder for companies to find professionals where they need them. For example, ICT jobs or also care jobs, as we saw also with the COVID pandemic. So knowing this, what I ask today is why can we not do more and better for gender occupational segregation? What is this missing factor? And this is actually where the unpaid work comes in. It's unpaid work is the factor that is, we know about it. We know it's an important determinant of how people participate in the labor market. And at the same time, we know it is greatly ignored by the traditional designs of labor market as well as social policies. When I talk about unpaid work, I refer to care for children, care for the elderly, or those with disabilities, as well as unpaid household work. This is the work that is out there that is hugely important, to what extent we can take on the paid employment, and still at the same time it is not really recognized in terms of importance for the current design in many public policies and also social protection policies. What are the impacts of the latter situation is that actually jobs that allow to carry on this unpaid work, let's say part-time teleworkable jobs, as John also referred to before, public jobs, even if they are low-paid jobs, as we also heard about before, are the jobs that women predominantly study for and aspire for. in anticipation of these care responsibilities coming onto their shoulders. Employers also pay women less or assign them to less promotable tasks still today in anticipation of unpaid care duties. Even though we talk about 2022 today, men still face a reverse reality on this, despite major improvements indeed that have been in the labor market. And the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, what we observe in the data, has increased the share of unpaid work. In summer 2021, we at IGE have collected actually a survey on gender equality and COVID consequences, where we focus on what is happening to the intensity and prevalence of unpaid work, just to see what would be the impact of this part of our lives on potential labor market consequences. So let me tell you today a little bit more from the emerging insights from the survey in relation to informal long-term care provision. So this is one type of the unpaid care that we have there. What we see in our data is that about 1/3 of women and men in the EU provide informal care and support in housework to their frail family members, neighbors, or friends, with the intensity of such care having increased since the start of the COVID pandemic. Provision of this informal care implies a different reality for women and men. Gender inequalities are in particular strong as regards intensity of care provision and as regards receiving support from external care services. So in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the services, workforce, care workforce being out there. And we know that among those indicating long-term care duties, those respondents, almost 60% of women perceive themselves as almost always, or for the most part, providing informal care. At the same time, about only 43% of men who indicate such existence of long-term care duties say they do so to the same extent. We also observe that at the same time, much fewer women carers than men carers are receiving support from formal long-term care services, so from the labor market, from the formal labor market, from the formal existing services. The largest gender gap is actually noted as regards residential long-term care services that are available to these people. We see that only 26% of female carers, but almost 40% of male carers use these services on a regular basis. Such gender differences as regards to intensity or availability of external care services when you need them, when you could use them actually, make a huge impact to what extent women and men can participate in the labor market. Gender norms as well as economic reality, of course, also imply that providing informal care is still a much more inflexible work-life balance factor for women than men. For example, with our survey, we also observed that if 68% of women with informal care duties are engaged in paid employment, 81% of men do so. So we have this huge difference still in terms of the labor market opportunities for the carers, women and men. Work-life balance also would theoretically imply that, for example, if we have to spend more hours at work, so in paid employment. At the same time, most likely we would need to reduce hours that we can spend on informal care. I mean, in theory, we all have only 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is unfortunately only a partial truth. We do observe that men's engagement in informal long-term care decreases when paid work becomes more intense, and that is logical. However, this is not a reality for majority of women. IGE survey shows that almost half of women whose paid work hours greatly increased during the COVID pandemic, also, for example, among the essential workers, etc., the same people also spent more time on providing informal long-term care. This was much less of a situation among men than among women. Long-term care is also only one type of unpaid work, of course. We still have childcare, and Sana will talk more about it. We also have other responsibilities at home. But let me tell a bit more still on the other side of what support the carers receive from formal services and what is happening there in relation to the COVID pandemic, in the aftermath, we hope so, of the COVID pandemic. For example, when we look into the statistical data and we compare 2019 to 2020 data that is already available, we observe that there are about 80,000 fewer childcare workers and teachers' aides in the EU So we have a very strong reduction in terms of the workforce in these essential occupations that are providing care, that also are providing education, early education to our children. And this is a workforce reduction by 4.3%. Just coming out of the COVID pandemic. And it comes, of course, on the top of already existing major staff shortages in these areas. The reduction in the number of the latter employees is due to reducing number of women, actually. These are highly feminized professions, and majority of these people who left these professions are women. At the aftermath of the pandemic, women are leaving these jobs with the biggest care intensity. And also it means that there is a huge impact, so the subsequent impact for many working mothers and fathers that are coming also our way. So their unpaid care duties most likely will increase simply because a number of the services will not be available externally. I would also like to talk a little bit more about the digitalization aspect, which of course became much more relevant during the COVID pandemic. Digitalization increased the speed, and it touches on different aspects of how we do work, of how it matters to employment, and also how it matters to unpaid work. So let me give a few examples just to start from our research. With the COVID pandemic, for example, we observed that the artificial intelligence used to optimize scheduling and task allocation has become very popular in female-dominated fields such as retail and hospitality sectors. Algorithmic scheduling in these fields allows, for example, the allocation of shifts on shorter notice. It also comes, of course, with increased income uncertainty and increasing work-life balance tensions. Monitoring and surveillance technologies applied more intensively in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic allow employers to track workers' activity in real time. The use of such surveillance technologies can actually penalize those workers who are teleworking and have to attend to their children or are interrupted by family members. And what we also observe with our survey that many of these people who indicate care duties, they actually have multiple care duties, and if they are teleworking, the care duties are present at the same time. Similarly, for example, one of the main reasons of working on digital platforms that we know of is a perception that digital platforms allows a higher flexibility of combining household duties, family commitments with work. So you take on a platform job because, okay, you think this will increase my flexibility and increase my balance for work and life. On the positive side, it shows that there is an increasing need for work-life balance. On the negative side, however, we observe that many platform workers are working an excessive number of hours. Many are unable to choose when to work, and their hours are also scattered throughout the day. So the penalties imposed by platforms for interrupted work are also detrimental to income levels and to combining work with care responsibilities at home. So it goes in a very vicious circle. You want to have this, but at the end of the day, you might not get it at all. As my closing remarks, I would like just to stress that various negative aspects of the COVID pandemic come with an increased visibility of reasons behind gender inequalities in the labor market. And the more we know on why these gender gaps exist, the larger is, of course, a chance for a positive change. I will stop here now and let Sana tell us more about the other care types and also telework and work-life balance, as well as gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina, for a very concise and excellent overview and also very timely. In the meantime, everybody who's watching, you can leave a comment or a question on our channels. And for those on Twitter, you can use hashtag EWD, International Women's Day, gender equality, or break the bias. So over to Sana Nivakovsky at Eurofound. You have the floor indeed to take us a little bit through the work Eurofound has done on work-life balance and other issues. Your floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So as John already mentioned earlier, we know that women are much more likely than men in the EU to work in teleworkable jobs, as we were saying. So jobs where working from home is potentially possible. And we see this already reflected in the data that were collected over the course of the pandemic as well. So we see that women indeed were more likely than men to then start working from home over the last 2 years. And of course, this has been great in the sense that, you know, modern technology allows us to be, some of us to be able to work from home. And this has protected the employment of many people and has allowed people to continue working throughout the pandemic while, you know, socially distancing from others, and hence helping us to protect each other's health as well. But beside this good success story in that sense, there have definitely been many challenges for a lot of people that have arisen from working from home over the last 2 years as well. And this is particularly the case for workers with families. So as we know, work wasn't the only thing that moved into the realm of the home over the last while. So maybe more particularly school closures, but also other restriction measures that were imposed by governments really meant that, especially for families and young families in particular, there has been this double burden of in the home at the same time, you know, dealing with work commitments and family and home commitments. And this burden is really shown in different indicators of work-life conflict, like Lena was mentioning. So these different indicators of work-life conflict have really kind of exploded over the pandemic when you compare to what the situation was beforehand in surveys before the pandemic. And we can see particularly worrying rates of work-life conflict when it comes to teleworkers with families, and in particular, teleworking mothers of young children. So this kind of imbalance in these work-life conflicts also reflects this gender care gap and imbalance that Lena was referring to earlier. But then again, we do need to remember and bear in mind that the pandemic has been a very particular time period and very unusual from many points of view. So when it comes to telework or working from home, it was very rapidly implemented in many countries very quickly. It was compulsory for many people, so no choice over the where to work from. And most importantly, it was in combination with many other pandemic restriction measures, such as school closures. And this kind of a mix of things makes it a very particular situation. So while, of course, we can learn many lessons from the data and the experience that everyone's gone through over the pandemic, but you shouldn't jump into too many conclusions, for example, of what the implications of working from home might be after the pandemic. And we do see this where it seems that for many workers, their estimate and feeling is that the benefits of working from home outweigh any downsides associated with it. And we see this in survey data gathered in the EU that show that a really large group of workers do wish to continue to telework and hybrid work even after the pandemic. And this is particularly the case among women. And we do know, of course, that hybrid working and working from home provides a lot of flexibility for workers, probably especially beneficial for workers with families. But then again, we do know from research carried out, for example, by Eurofound even before the pandemic, that for people who work from home, there's a higher risk of this blurring of boundaries between work life and home life. You have a higher risk of working longer hours. You have a higher risk of working in your free time, and you have a higher risk of feeling isolated from your colleagues and from your workplace. So there is this potential risk that for people who continue to hybrid work and telework going forward will face being less visible in the workplace going forward, and this might have knock-on impacts then on possibilities for career progression and promotion which can potentially then impact even pay and future pensions of these workers. So, and as we know that there is this gender gap in teleworkability of jobs and in the desire to telework after the pandemic, there is, of course, then this concern that this will be another way in which you see gender divides, both in the labour market and at home, arising from these complications. But I think I leave it there for the time being, and we'll go to the discussion then.
Thank you very much, Sanna. Thank you very much, all the three experts from Eurofound and EIGE, for these excellent introductions. I'd like to get you back on the screen so we can start our conversation. And viewers, you're invited to leave a comment or a question in the comment box. You can see it online. The first question I have for each of you, in fact, is Sanna just said no conclusions, and that is probably a good mindful remark. But can you reflect a little bit on what can be good practices or what has worked in terms of addressing some of the inequalities you have described? Let's say the gender inequalities in unpaid care work, Lina. Do we know a little bit on where at least the beginning of solutions can be, even if perhaps it's too early to say that they are indeed hard conclusions to take at this stage?
Yes, thank you, Dennis, for the question. I guess I'm starting the first one, right?
Yes.
I will leave also space for Sana and John. But so when it comes to really where to start, what could be the good examples? I would think in terms of the policy solutions, what we observe is promoting a fairer distribution of unpaid care. I think it would be naive to expect that unpaid care load would decrease in the coming years. We know that the workforce is really, I think we have major shortages in lots of care dimensions. They're not going to be solved in the next 5 or 10 years. And so in the areas where the policy could make an impact, is actually one of the things is to promote much more actively a more fairer distribution within the household members, within the communities, to spend much more action thinking of where the help can come in. And at the same time, we still have lots of scope in reforming our social protection policies, our public policies, to really, for example, to allow even to increase access to parental leave to those who don't have access to it, and that would affect, for example, platform workers. We know there are already positive steps in this direction coming from the EU level and also at the state level. But so these directions are very good policy examples. So to allow people to combine work with unpaid care duties in a much more sustainable way, in a way that actually allows more different employee groups, so also platform workers, but also those who don't really are in other standard employment forms. So for example, those with nominations, those who are CEOs at the company. So as John also mentioned before, the gender gap is huge in the best paid jobs. And these are actually also the jobs that set examples in the society of how we go about our lives, of how we can do it together, women and men. And so I'm not only referring to CEOs, I'm also talking about politicians, about judges, about academia. And in many of these professions, no matter how small they are in terms of the statistical numbers, there is a lot of potential in terms of providing very positive model roles for gender equality in terms of how to share care duties more equally between women and men. So yes, there is plenty, I think, of good examples coming from local level, coming into the state or EU level, at the policy level of what we can do more in order to share care more equally, and of course this would have, I think, major impact on the labor market, and also our vision and targets for where women's employment rates should be in the next 10 or 20 years. Thank you.
Lina, if I can just jump in there, I think it's not just a question of unpaid work, which needs to be more equally distributed between men and women. It's also about actually paid work in the caring economy. This is the sector where we've seen the bulk of our employment growth over the last 2 decades. It's been a strong driver of employment growth, and a lot of that's been female employment growth. If we're to reduce gender gaps in the labour market, we're also talking about men deciding to become nurses or childcare workers in greater numbers than they are at the moment. I think that's very important. So, I'd say that you have to look at the fact that caring, the caring economy is both in the unpaid sector and in the paid sector, and it tends to be very, very female dominated. These are sectors with big labour shortages. So there's a big demand for labour in them, and there still seems to be a strong reluctance for men to kind of actively involve themselves in the paid part of the caring economy. And that's something we need to address as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely, John. I very much agree on this. I think indeed, when we think about care, the more we have external support, maybe the less, maybe not all of it, it's not possible, but the less we have to do it in the informal way at home. And indeed, we lack men dramatically in the care sector. It's maybe depends a bit on which parts of it, but maybe the COVID pandemic has brought some good examples there. Let's see. When the jobs are getting scarce, I think it's not only reluctance from the men's side to come in. There are lots of real factors of what pushes away, including also strong gender stereotypes and stigma even for men coming in the certain sectors, into the certain professions. And it's not to exclude also their working conditions and pay. So we have a number of factors indeed, and they need to be solved, and we need a change on those in order to make progress for gender equality.
Sanna?
Yeah, so of course, I would very much highlight again, like Lena was on the importance of promoting change in gender norms at home, and of course, parental leave and more equal sharing of parental leave and policies in that regard are definitely one of the key components here. And I suppose, another aspect that could be important, as we have been discussing this gender divide in teleworkability of jobs, ensuring or trying to make sure that this kind of divide isn't very big, having policies that promote more gender equal take-up of telework in the future would also go some way towards ensuring that the balances at home as well reflect, a better gender balance.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You all of you almost addressed this. Of course, the issue of gender stereotypes. The Commission, the EU, is actually launching a campaign this year on or actually against gender stereotypes. So it would be good to know if also these issues are addressed. We got a question in from Amber, who asks the panel, based on your experience, what do you see as the main drivers which lead to women being overrepresented in less well-paying jobs? And he or she adds to it, I don't know, research suggests multiple various intersecting factors playing a role in this gendered employment. But which do you notice most or find most prevalent? Who wants to react?
Can I just say that I
Yeah.
think an important factor, and probably the most important factor, is that women's caring work has traditionally been undervalued. Whether it's done by women, the type of work that's associated with caring, looking after other people, it's been work that hasn't been accorded the value that perhaps it deserves in our societies. So I think that's a strong part. I think there's a lot of path dependency to these differences. It takes a long time for them to basically wash out of your culture, if you like. But I do think that the undervaluation of female work and the overvaluation of some types of male work, relatively speaking, is a big part of why women are overrepresented in less well-paying jobs.
Lina or Sanna, on the question?
Yes, I would actually agree with John also. I think it has to do a lot about having a major share of women or men in a certain field. That actually goes in line with what we observe happening to the wages or the income. So just as a historical example, I think we could take teaching profession. 100 years ago, it was
Yeah.
male dominated, very prestigious, high income, lots of in-kind benefits associated with it. Now we have a female dominated profession, which is actually equalized to a certain care job and undervalued, I think, very often. So this is just a change, and indeed there is a lots of past dependence of how we value what women do and what men do. So this is maybe from the horizontal perspective of where men and women work. On the other side, we also have vertical segregation still, which is, if you take an individual and you look in terms of career progression, I would still stress that women are in less paying jobs, let's say even if it's a certain occupation, because of anticipation and actual take up of the unpaid care work. So they are actually assigned to certain not so much promotable tasks, and so career progression is slowed down at the moment when there is maybe I would not say a risk, but the possibility of children arriving. So at the stage of their parenthood, women would be placed more aside than men. At the stage of the parenthood becoming more real, men actually would be promoted much faster, where women demoted. And this is in anticipation of sickness, for example. So the need to care for sick children, to the need to take care of maybe also frailing elderly family members, etc. And the scale load is anticipated by employers, and they would simply reduce women's career possibility very often. So I think it's two sides of the if we would have a more, again, I would stress this, a more equal sharing of care roles, women would not be disproportionately losing their income when this actual care job happens, and also in anticipation of it. And actually, the interesting thing maybe to say is that if we would look into the young people nowadays and the gender pay gap for the young people, it's almost non-existent. The gender pay gap appears as of age 25, 29, 30, when actually when we start seeing the care roles coming into the people's lives. So it's very much life
Yeah.
dependent, life events dependent. And
Yeah. Perhaps, Lina,
Mhm.
there was a follow-up question, and it links a bit to what you just said. The question was on what generational aspects or intergenerational aspects we see, for example, how care duties are shared between women and men. You just referred to it in regards to the pay gap. Can you
Mhm.
also say something around care duties? Do you see generational or age issues there?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is there is a strong evidence that, for example, if you're coming from the households where you observe the mom not working and doing everything
Mm,
at home, taking care of the children and household work, and the father helps, so it's not, you don't refer to the equal sharing of these responsibilities. You take on it, you go further. So it's very hard to break these gender stereotypes, and of course it stays there. At the same time, what we also observe, maybe it's a positive sign, and I'm not sure if it's attributed to COVID, maybe to the extent to the COVID. So, for example, we observed in our survey that maybe there is a generational change.
mm,
So, among the women and men who indicate that they, for example, use external support, the major share of these people are actually younger people.
mm,
So these people who dare to take on external support, they do not say, okay, it's stigmatizing that I ask for an external support in order to have an unpaid job. I will not do it just by myself. Maybe they go an extra mile, I don't know, to arrange this. Maybe they're coming from cities, so from urban areas, not rural areas. But so there are lots of factors, and we can actually observe a certain generation change in terms of how care is being arranged,
mm.
so from different channels, from different sources, in order to provide it to the family members. Yeah.
Sanna, do you see similar generational trends, for example, in childcare or other areas in your research?
Well, I haven't particularly looked at that issue, but there is this, promising and interesting prospect that, even when you have this short-term shock being the pandemic period, that you do see, even though it's a minority of families where fathers may have, increased their share of care duty. Say if it's a family where only the father has teleworked and been at home more, and has increased their share of care. You might see some of this behavior sticking, hopefully for the longer run, that it's not just a pandemic where you see these shifts, that this might lead to longer term impacts. And of course, then looking at the even longer term, looking at the children who are growing up in these families, who grew up even for a shorter period of time, the father was more involved in caregiving. They will see a different way of doing things again, and they might have different social norms when they grow up and they set up their own families. So there is these glimmers of hope and change, that come from these transformations.
John, you took us in the beginning through a bit of a longer time perspective on labor market and gender segregation. Do you believe that the pandemic, perhaps in 5 or 10 years, that we look back and that we can say, the pandemic has had some mid or longer term good or bad impact on gender segregation in the labor market? It's a very difficult question to answer, I think, for now. But what is your assessment of that?
Well, it is a very hard question to answer, and it's not one that I'm going to hazard too much of a guess on. But the best way of looking at the future is generally to look at what's happening at present and to assume that things might more or less broadly remain on trend. And if the growth if a lot of our growth of our employment is in sectors like health or education, as has been the case over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, then it seems likely that this will continue to contract the gender employment gap. It'll continue to encourage women to participate in the labor market. I think one of the things we're all saying is that those sectoral sources of demand in labor need to be more kind of equitably distributed across the genders for a whole bunch of reasons, in terms of distributing the care responsibilities both in the paid and unpaid labor market. But again, that's just kind of extrapolating from what we know is happening at present. I'm not sure if if COVID has changed things too much. If anything, I think it's expanded our sense of the importance of public health in general. And as I said, that might be reflected in greater kind of social investment, public investment in these sectors. And again, all things being equal, one would expect that to boost female more than male employment.
Okay. Sandra wrote us and she asks how to improve working conditions by policies in the healthcare sector. You just referred to health, John. For example, midwives in Sweden have called for this in many years, but nothing is happening. How can this be regulated with an effect? And perhaps that question is an interesting one for a more general question. And I don't know to what extent you have evidence there, but can you see from your data in countries where there has been more government interventions in regulation, that things are working out better than countries where there has been perhaps a bit more market, let the market solve problems? This was a specific question from Sandra on healthcare. What can be done? Who would dare to formulate an answer to that point?
Lena made a point earlier on, which I thought was very apposite, which is, I think this was actually in our discussion before we went live, which was that, in some countries there's a very clear evidence of women just abandoning essential jobs, probably because of the level of stress that they experienced during the pandemic, working on the front line in health. So this is clearly an issue. It's also part of the background to why there are increasing labor shortages in precisely this sector across all of our countries. So I take Sandra's point well. I think it's a very important point. We need to think about the quality of work, and we have to make sure that work in these very potentially stressful jobs is made more bearable and supportable for the people who do them.
Mm-hmm. Lina?
Yes, I would like just to continue on what John has said also, and maybe to stress that, of course, changes happen when priorities put differently. So there is a potential that, for example, also with recovery funds, with recovery policies, and so a number of more of gender sensitive evaluations would start to see how, you know, where the funds are going, how policies are impacting women and men differently. Now, for a specific occupation as midwives, of course, it's very hard to say how can one change this. It would depend a lot in terms of the policies, how they are supporting self-employed or if these are employees, and we know that there is a huge difference in terms of how income is distributed and how care, for example, is and leave periods are assigned to those in self-employment and those in just standard employment. So it really depends what are the issues behind and what kind of employment form different occupation groups have. Also, okay, maybe Sweden is I think would be the country where we have very strong trade unions, etc. But we also know that in the occupations, for example, where trade unions are not present, and that affects actually quite a number of different care professions, we also have a very strong dampening effect on wages. So it's lots of different factors where the effect could come in, and so it could be both indeed public policy, trade unions, and again looking into how different employment forms that we have now in the labor market affect incomes of women and men.
Sanna, anything to add on this one?
No, I think John and Lena covered this very well already. Thank you.
Lena, you touched upon recovery plans, the EU efforts to support member states. Let's indeed turn our attention a little bit to the EU policy agenda. We have quite an interesting year with indeed recovery plans, the care package, the data from EIGE and from Eurofound are informing these initiatives. What can you say or hope perhaps that these policy initiatives will bring to the issues that you raised in this webinar?
I think it's a very important question. You know, maybe just coming a bit from my background, I'm an economist working in gender equality field now, and I always had this huge regret that, for example, macroeconomic forecasting and macroeconomic modeling does not take gender into account at all. So now we have the recovery plan that actually promised to look into the gender equality, you know, even if it's perhaps not, you know, as detailed and not as impactful as we wish to have on our side. However, I think it's a good step forward, and I would really think of it as a good opportunity to see how we go further. And just to say from EIGE's side, maybe is that we are doing research and we are going to look more closer in terms of the effects of different recovery plan aspects and how women and men would be affected by that. And of course, try to provide it as soon as possible to the policymakers.
Sanna?
Yeah, thank you. There's of course a lot happening in the policy area of many of the questions we talked about today. So of course, care strategy in Europe being formulated. So this will of course touch upon both the informal and formal care provision and the situation of carers of many types. But I suppose maybe the topics that I was talking about to do with telework, like that's another policy area where there's a lot of development ongoing and things coming out. So at national and EU level, and of course things like right to disconnect, these kinds of policies will hopefully come in place and kind of safeguard the well-being of teleworkers as well. Thank you.
Are there any front runners, you would say, Sanna, in the EU where inspiration is taken from? Have you discovered, particularly when it comes to teleworking and addressing some of the problematic sides of it, or even if not singling out a country, what you believe is a promising perspective on this?
I wouldn't have a view on that, actually. I don't know, John, if you've come across that much in your work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you can talk about the countries which have been pioneers in introducing right to disconnect legislation, and France would be an obvious example. It introduced the legislation 7 years ago, I think, and there have been, there's now legislation either in place in 6 or 7 countries in the EU, and with other legislative proposals in the pipelines. So that's important from a gender perspective, because what we've been saying is teleworkable employment and actual teleworking incidence has been higher for women than for men. So the teleworking in particular is associated with longer working hours, with blurred boundaries between work and non-work life. And so the whole urgency, if you like, of the right to disconnect legislation becomes more evident. So I think it's not just right to disconnect. That's one small part of it. There's a lot of social partner work coming up with accords on digitalization more generally, either at the company level, at the national level, and even at the European level. So there's a lot of activity both amongst legislators directly making new laws, but also amongst social partners trying to map out a future for how, for instance, teleworking is going to play out, or hybrid working is going to play out in the coming years, and including looking at some of the kind of gender aspects of that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. We're almost at the end of this hour, so let's look a little bit ahead into the future and your closing remarks, if you wish. And I don't want to end on a very negative note, but of course one cannot exclude that the pandemic comes back in or continues in a way that would severely impact our daily lives. So from your perspective, and the issues that you addressed, John, in relation to the job market in general, Lina in relation to unpaid care work, Sana in relation to telework and childcare, are we ready? If in the worst case scenario, if in autumn the pandemic would get worse again, do we think we have enough lessons learned, and do you believe that we have at least the data and the evidence from our research that would inform as good as we can the policymakers, our governments, our practitioners to move on?
Dennis, would you mind if I answer a different question? One that's been raised in the
that's fine too.
Lecturers, one of the people online watching us, and it's specifically, he asked about the Pay Transparency Directive, and it just what I want to say kind of addresses some of the issues that Lina has raised and also Sana. And it's also a positive message. The EU has proposed legislation in 2 areas which connect with pay. The Pay Transparency Directive, which Lefteris in the chat has asked us about, but also the minimum wage proposed minimum wage directive, and both of these have some kind of direct or indirect gender consequences, which I think in both cases are positive. Minimum wages, because it basically raises wages at the bottom of the wage distribution, where we've been saying for the last hour, women are concentrated more than men. So minimum wages have always been a good and positive thing for reducing gender pay gaps. So anything that reinforces minimum wages is a good thing from a gender equality perspective. And then just to answer, Lefteris's comment, what do we think or anticipate might be the consequences of pay transparency? Well, Sana's made the point that the gender pay gap is it basically starts to increase from the age of 30 onwards, basically. It's more or less, it doesn't exist up on, for younger people, it's very, very small, almost marginal. But the gender pay gap also increases up the wage distribution, and it's much, much higher in well-paid jobs. Pay Transparency Directive is basically designed to iron out or to identify if there are any reasonable, if there's any reasonable basis for these differentials, in particular in high-paid jobs, and in particular as they might affect, differentials between male and female pay. So I think both of these proposed pieces of legislation potentially are positive as regards addressing some of the gender inequalities we've been talking about.
Thanks a lot, John. 2 minutes left. Sana, what would be your final message to this in this webinar?
Well, we have seen that the pandemic has been difficult for a lot of people, and if it did continue and there was another wave, of course, there would be gender imbalances in the impact, of course, but hopefully we have learned some lessons. But the interactions between gender inequality in work and in unpaid work will continue to be an issue that we do need to tackle on both ends.
Absolutely. And Lina, please.
Thank you. I think as my last words, I would actually just introduce one more term, and it's a green transition.
Mm.
That's really a promising way of changing behavior. And if it comes in a gender sensitive way, maybe already as of autumn, we might see some behavior changes that could bring on really on a much more sustainable, much more ecological and gender sensitive way of sharing what we have and then how we do work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lina. And for those of you, this is one who didn't know yet, this is one of the areas that EIGE is looking into next year actually as an area of priorities. So thank you very much for bringing in that green perspective in the final round. I would like to thank all the three experts, John, Sana, and Lina, for very enlightening and good contributions, and the viewers for asking very good questions. We try to tackle as many as we could. Um, we thank everybody who has been watching, everybody who has organized this webinar. Please stay in touch with EIGE and Eurofound through the social media channels and sign up for our newsletters and follow us online. And also, I would like to point out that we actually jointly, in the cooperation between EIGE and Eurofound, have also made a podcast around issues around the pandemic and gender equality, which you can find on eurofound.europa.eu. And if you click a few times, you'll find the podcast where more interesting information can be found. I thank everybody very much for the attention, particularly again our experts, and wishing you a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.